The year is 890, 71 degrees north, the very top of Norway, above the Arctic Circle where the coastline finally gives up and bends east toward a sea that has no name on any map. One open wooden ship rides the swell off that last cape. A handful of men aboard. History never recorded how many. Around them, water cold enough to take a swimmer's breath in seconds and his life in minutes. No compass, no charts, no engine, no radio, no rescue coming. The nearest friendly harbor is 6 days' sail behind them, and the man at the steering oar, a trader named Ohthere, is not lost, and he is not praying. He is working. Weeks later, he brings that ship home intact, and his voyage ends up written down at the court of an English king. The first recorded Arctic voyage in human history, not because he was tougher than the sea, because the ship under his feet was a system, layer upon layer of deliberate engineering. That's what this video is about. Every layer, every detail. And the last layer, the one that kept these ships alive for 300 years, has nothing to do with wood or tar at all. Let me ask you something. How long do you think an open wooden boat should last in Arctic water? Here's what that water actually does to ships. When air drops below freezing and the wind is up, every wave that breaks over the bow stops being water and becomes ballast. Spray lands on rails, rigging, deck, and freezes where it lands, layer over layer, high above the waterline. Ice is heavy. Tons of it accumulate in hours, all of it in exactly the wrong place, lifting the vessel's center of gravity until physics quietly takes a vote. In the first weeks of 1968, 3 steel trawlers out of Hull, St. Romanus, Kingston Peridot, and Ross Cleveland, were lost in these same northern waters. 58 men gone, 1 survivor. The Ross Cleveland capsized off Iceland while her crew fought the ice with axes, steel hulls, diesel engines, radio, radar. It wasn't enough. And that was a day trip compared to what the Norse ran routinely. The open water passage from Iceland to the Greenland settlements is on the order of 1,500 kilometers, days upon days beyond sight of land, through the Denmark Strait, where the East Greenland current carries pack ice and growlers south even in the sailing season. Fall into that water, and cold shock takes your breath in the first minute. Useful movement is gone in 10 or 15. No immersion suit, no lifeboat, no Coast Guard. Now hold that thought against this. For 3 centuries, Norse crews worked these exact seas, Lofoten, Iceland, Greenland, the Barents Coast, in open boats. No deck to shelter under, hull planks thinner than your thumb. The Gokstad ship, excavated from a Norwegian burial mound in 1880, is nearly 24 meters of ocean-going hull, and amidships, her oak planking measures barely 2.5 centimeters. The workhorse of the Atlantic runs, the cargo ship the Norse called a nar. The ocean-going example scuttled at Skulldelev is about 16 meters, was broader, deeper, higher-sided, and moved everything that built the North Atlantic world. Timber, livestock, walrus ivory, entire households of settlers. Same construction, same impossibly thin planking. That's not a small claim. That's a plank you could flex with your hands, standing between a crew and the Arctic. There's this image most people carry around. Dragon-headed warships crashing through storm waves, kept afloat by sheer barbarian toughness and a high pain threshold. That's wrong, not even close. Toughness doesn't stop freezing spray, and courage has never once kept a seam watertight. The Norse survived because they were, plank for plank, the best naval engineers of their age. People who solved cold water problems so precisely that modern boat builders still study the solutions. What follows is that system, layer by layer, each one more clever than the last. Start with the plank itself, because almost everything people assume about it is backwards. A Viking hull plank was never sawn. The Norse didn't use sawmills, and that turns out to be an advantage. Shipwrights took a green oak trunk, fresh and full of moisture, and split it. Wedges of iron and wood, driven in sequence along the length, cleaving the trunk radially into segments like slices of a cake, then worked down with axes to thickness. Here's why that matters. A saw cuts wherever you point it, straight through the grain, severing wood fibers by the thousand and leaving weak points all along the board. A split follows the grain. It cannot cross the fibers. The wood itself refuses. So, a cleft plank comes away with its fibers running continuous and unbroken from end to end, keeping nearly the full strength of the living tree in a board a fraction of its size. If you've ever split firewood, you know the feeling. The wood wants to open along its own lines, and it tells your hands where those lines are. Modern engineers rediscovered this principle with carbon fiber. Strength doesn't come from the material alone. It comes from keeping the fibers aligned and intact. The Norse were doing fiber-oriented composite work with wedges and a trained eye. It goes further. For the ribs and curved members, builders selected grown crooks, branches, and trunk junctions that had grown in the required curve, so the grain followed the shape of the part instead of being cut across it. The 5 ships scuttled around 1070 in Roskilde Fjord and excavated at Skuldelev in 1962 show exactly this economy. Radially cleft oak and pine, nothing wasted, every part chosen, so the tree's own architecture did the structural work. Strong and light is precisely what you want in freezing seas. Less hull to drive through the water, more freeboard for the same weight, a boat that rises to a wave instead of burying its bow in it. But a strong plank is only the beginning, because the real genius of these ships wasn't that they were strong, it's that they were allowed to move. Everything about a Viking hull was built to flex on purpose. The construction is called clinker. Each plank overlaps the one below it like roof shingles, and the overlaps are fastened with hand-forged iron rivets, thousands of them, each one peened by hand over a small iron plate. The shell of planking was built first, plank by overlapping plank, and only then were the frames fitted inside it. And here's the detail that separates a Viking ship from nearly everything that came after. On ships like Gokstad and Oseberg, the lower planks weren't nailed to those frames at all. They were lashed to them, flexible spruce root tied through cleats carved from the solid plank, a joint that grips but gives. The result was a hull that could twist. In 1893, a Norwegian captain named Magnus Andersen built a faithful replica of the Gokstad ship and sailed it across the North Atlantic to Newfoundland in under a month. He reported the gunnels twisting visibly out of true movement you could watch, the bottom flexing with the seas, and the ship staying tight and dry the whole way, logging up to 11 knots. Andersen called the elasticity an advantage no rigid boat could match. And this wasn't a one-off romantic stunt that got lucky. In 2007, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde sent the Sea Stallion, a full reconstruction of the 30-meter Skuldelev warship, built plank for plank with the old methods, across the North Sea to Dublin with a crew of 60, instrumented like a laboratory. The researchers measured the same thing Andersen felt: a hull working constantly, visibly, deliberately, and holding. Think about a modern airliner. Watch the wingtips in turbulence. They flex, meters of travel, absorbing energy, that would snap a rigid wing clean off. Same principle 1,000 years apart. In heavy cold water seas, a rigid hull takes every wave as a hammer blow, and rigid joints in freezing conditions crack. A flexible hull sheds that energy. It works with the wave. There's a real debate here, and it's worth having. Some scholars say the lashed frames were simply tradition, a leftover from older Sawn boat techniques that northern builders never abandoned. Others argue it was deliberate engineering, a weight saving of tons, and a flexibility the builders could feel through their feet and refined generation after generation. Accident of habit or iteration toward a design goal, drop your view below. But notice what flexibility costs. A hull that works and twists has 10,000 fastenings and seams that work and twist with it. Every one of them is a leak waiting to happen, unless the seal can move too. Between every pair of overlapping planks, before a single rivet was driven, the builder laid down a cord of wool or animal hair, soaked through with pine tar. Archaeologists call it looting, and it is the quiet masterpiece of the whole ship. Consider what that seam has to do. It has to keep the Arctic out, while the two planks it lives between slide and shear against each other with every wave, in temperatures that make most materials brittle. A hard seal, dried pitch, rigid putty, cracks the first cold night the hull flexes. Tarred wool doesn't. The wool keeps its spring fiber by fiber, compressing and rebounding as the seam breathes. Unwashed, it carries lanolin, the grease that makes a sheep waterproof, and unlike plant fiber, it resists rotting in seawater. The pine tar packs the gaps, sheds water, and stays workable in cold that would shatter anything harder. It's a gasket, the same job the rubber ring in your car engine does, invented in wool and resin, and the tar itself tells you how seriously the Norse took it. In 2018, archaeologist Andreas Henius at Uppsala University published evidence that by the 8th century, Scandinavians were producing pine tar in huge funnel-shaped forest pits, some yielding up to 300 liters in a single firing. 300 liters. That's not a farmer waterproofing his rowboat. That's industrial production, a supply chain of forest tar-feeding shipyards across the north, timed to the very start of the Viking Age. If this is the kind of detail you come here for, a like takes a second and genuinely helps. Modern marine engineering re-derived all of this in the 20th century. Flexible polyurethane and silicone sealants, engineered in laboratories to stay elastic through freeze-thaw cycles. The Norse got there with sheep and burned pine stumps. If you've ever run a bead of caulk on a cold day and found it cracked by spring, you know exactly the problem they solved 1,000 years ago on a hull that never stopped moving. And still, none of it was enough, because no seal, no plank, no rivet wins against the Arctic at its absolute worst. The final layer of the system was knowing better than to fight that battle at all. Here's something that almost never appears in the popular version of this story, and it might be the most impressive layer of all. Viking ships survived the brutal Arctic winter because they were almost never in the water for it. The Norse sailing season ran from late spring to early autumn, and when it closed, the ships came out of the sea, hauled up rollers onto land, and in a great many cases into a purpose-built boathouse, the Nost. Archaeological surveys along the Norwegian coast have recorded hundreds of Nost foundations from the Iron Age and Viking period, some large enough to swallow a full longship, doors facing the water, walls of stone and turf. The sagas treat this as so ordinary, it barely rates a sentence. Ships set up on shore for the winter, propped and covered, the fjord left to freeze without them. If you've ever hauled a boat out for the season or drained the pipes in a cabin before the first hard frost, you know exactly what this is. The quiet, unglamorous work that decides whether the thing you love survives the winter. Winter wasn't downtime. Winter was the maintenance season. Under that roof, the hull dried out, safe from ice that would crush a moored boat in the shore ice and spray that would bury it. Crews retarred the planking, renewed the wool looting in tired seams, replaced sprung rivets and rotten strakes. The ship you launched in spring was never quite the ship you'd hauled out in autumn. It was newer. A Viking ship wasn't a product. It was a process, continuously rebuilt for as long as the community chose to keep it alive. And it was the community. The Leidang, the ship levy recorded in the Gulathing law, made vessels public infrastructure. Coastal districts were obligated to build ships, man them, and maintain them, which meant the boathouse, the tar, the winter labor were institutional, not one owner's hobby. Aviation figured this out a millennium later. An airliner flies safely for decades, not because aluminum is immortal, but because scheduled teardown and inspection never stops. We call it preventive maintenance and print it on a spreadsheet. They called it winter and wrote it into law. Step back from the details for a moment. Look at what's actually in front of you. Planks split, never sawn, so the tree's fibers run unbroken end to end. A shell of overlapping strakes, riveted thin and light. Frames lashed with spruce root, so the whole hull can twist and shed the sea's energy instead of absorbing it as blows. Seams gasketed in tarred wool that flexes exactly as much as the hull does, in cold that turns lesser materials to glass. And around all of it, a calendar and a boathouse, and a law that pulled the entire machine out of the ocean before the ocean turned fully lethal and rebuilt it every single winter. No single layer worked alone. The flexible hull would leak without the flexible seal. The seal only lasted because winter renewed it. Winter renewal only happened because law and custom made the ship everyone's responsibility. Remove any one layer and the system fails. These people weren't survivors. They were engineers of survival. They didn't build ships strong enough to fight the North Atlantic. Nothing they could build was, and nothing we build truly is. They built ships that agreed with the sea, bend where it pushes, seal where it probes, and be gone before its worst arrives. Steel and horsepower and radar tried the other approach in 1968, meeting the ice head-on with rigid strength. The ice won in a night. Same waters, opposite philosophy, 1,000 years apart. If this is the kind of history you come here for, not Hollywood raids, not horned helmets, but how these people actually thought and engineered answers to problems that still kill sailors today, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribing means you'll be here for what comes next, and there is a great deal more to tell. The next time you run weather stripping around a door before winter, or step over a freshly caulked seam on a wooden dock, consider what you're really doing. Keeping a flexible seal alive so the cold stays on its side of the line. Then think of one open boat off the top of Norway in the year 90. Fibers unbroken, seams breathing, a crew you could count on your fingers, working a sea that would swallow steel trawlers 11 centuries later, and coming home. The Arctic never rewarded the strongest hull. It rewarded the one that knew how to yield, where to seal, and when to leave. Strength impresses, design endures,